Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So today we're doing one of our more traditional readings pieces. We're going to talk about some philosophy like we used to do back in the day. We are talking about to start with at least, an article by Ed Rooksby called The Relationship Between Liberalism and Socialism. And I have no idea who Ed Rooksby is.
It looks like he might be an academic at Oxford, as far as I could tell, from the very, very last page there. But hat tip to Aaron Anderson for this piece. I thought it was pretty good. And then we will probably get to philosopher Liam Kofi Bright, internet hero, famed internet philosopher, and his post, Why I Am Not a Liberal, and a response from another intellectual named Owen. But they all kind of go together, on the topic of what liberalism is, how it arose, what its principles are, and why or how it's insufficient, basically. And for the Rooksby piece, but I think implicitly in the other pieces, how those insufficiencies relate to socialism as an alternative, I think, right?
I think this is it's an interesting article. It's I think a little bit challenging for a socialist, the Rooksby piece, that is, because you're,
and for liberals, as he points out, for both liberals and socialists.
The basic argument is that, socialism as he, characterizes it as like sort of a transcendence and overcoming of what he says. Quote, socialism is best regarded as the radicalization and transcendence of liberalism. Socialism draws on the normative principles that drove the bourgeois revolutions and which liberal society professes to embody, and demands that these ideals are more fully realized. And I think, the first thing to say about this, and I think it's a very important point, is, he draws out, a whole number of social examples of historical socialists or supposed socialists like Lenin and Trotsky, Stalin and Mao, who were very contemptuous of, what they call bourgeois, liberties, freedom to vote, suffrage and stuff like that. And he says that it's bad for two reasons. On the one hand, he said you end up, you quote, surrender to the prevailing liberal view that the democratic rights and liberties that have grown up under liberalism are inextricable from the current social order. And then on the other hand, quote, it is also dangerous in that it seems to justify and indeed even require the abolition of existing democratic rights and liberties on the part of socialists in power, which is in fact what, Lenin and Stalin did. And that, I think we can safely conclude, was bad. It did not work. It was bad for the people and the long-term stability of the system itself.
And I fall prey to this. I get so mad at the current order, which I think Rooksby does a good job of showing is intertwined historically and now with capitalism, and is so hegemonic that it bleeds into, liberalism bleeds into adjacent ideologies, and basically any other form of life right now is kind of like forced into a liberal framework. And so I can certainly sound like I'm just wholesale rejecting liberalism or castigating liberals as such. And this is, I think, a piece that's helpful for not falling into that trap because of how he says socialism is the realization of the ideals and principles that actual practicing liberalism cannot fulfill because of the contradictions of liberalism itself. So like the stated principles of liberalism, equality and liberty, cannot be realized because of the third, he calls mediating force, or the role played by the mediating principle of private property and the private ownership of the means of production, right? And because of that, and the class struggle that ensues, the promise of universal equality and universal liberty necessarily can't be realized unless socialism transcends liberalism, right? And I think that's an interesting way to think about it.
Yeah, and I like that. I like that way of approaching this situation because, as you say, you look at existing liberal regimes in history and in practice today, and you can see it all associated with all sorts of horrible shit. The British Empire is incredibly exploitative, colonial system of trade. How poor countries today, are just like surviving on scraps from, the fall off the table, between the United States, Europe, and China, and all the various wars and shit like that. And I think that it can be logical for a lot of people to just conclude that all this is bullshit. That look at these freedoms that you espouse, you hypocrite, you liar.
Yes.
And therefore the freedoms themselves, the whole idea is nonsense and we don't need to do it. But I think that that's the wrong way to look at it. You need to say, no. Go ahead.
I actually have students that, before they take my courses, they say, I hated the Declaration of Independence. And, it's just obviously it's a complete lie and hypocrisy, et cetera, et cetera. But the very idea, therefore, it surprised me, actually, that the very idea of equality and freedom as natural rights and the very idea that those things are meaningful was nonsense because of the practical failure of our system historically and today to live up to the ideals that they were throwing the baby out with the bathwater, And so I think that's where it's so important to have a socialist response, which says, no, the ideals are good. It's just they're not realized in this system for a very good reason, but they can be. And when they are, you will like that. That will be good. Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And as he, points out, you can point to all manner of movements and, societies that like things that have happened basically because, downtrodden groups seized on the sort of, universalist moral, ideals in like the Declaration of Independence or the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, or, all the various liberal theorists that have worked and written throughout the years and pointed to the hypocrisy, and said, we women, we deserve the vote just like men. Yes. Slavery is Jamel Bouie has a great piece. Actually, we're recording this, funnily enough, on the 4th of July. And, his piece is all about how the Declaration of Independence, as a sort of sacred document in American history is to a great degree the creation of like anti-slavery activists, above all like Abraham Lincoln, that for a long time after it was signed, it was basically forgotten for like 20 years. It wasn't really that important. It wasn't considered like it is today. And this was a result of people saying like, look at, here's like a handy thing that we can like use rhetorically and in our movements and organizations to push, for a more equal society, live up to your bullshit slogans. And, it was remarkably successful.
Our good friend Harvey J. Kaye talks about this, right? That radicals in our history have always drawn on those founding principles and drawn on the ideals that were not being fulfilled, and drawn on those fighting for them against those who would see them suppressed. That is a tradition in this country that's very American. And it's important too to show that, like, Machiavelli says there's an important civic religion that creates stability and allows for a good kind of republican order. And you have to build in you have to constitute, the Constitution is kind of a living thing. You have to constitute your polity by returning to founding principles again and again, especially when things are falling into disorder and chaos and so forth. And so like the idea of universal freedom and equality persists because of how it comes into conflict with all these exclusions and all these, oppressions that just people can't but say, wait a minute, we're a country that's supposed to be about these things. Well, why is that not true for this person, for that person, for this group, for that group, right? But mentioning Machiavellian republicanism, though, reminds me that like once we get through talking about the virtues of this piece, I guess it does. It occurs to me that like it's maybe not liberalism per se that has complete ownership historically of freedom, at least, if not also equality, because republicanism, right, and modern republicanism from Machiavelli to Rousseau is very much about a kind of freedom that he distinguishes when he says that socialist freedom is different from liberal freedom, right? And this is where we get to the ontology and like the way that liberalism says that freedom is only individual and only legal and not economic. And socialism says that it's actually social because we're social creatures, not just, individuals by our nature. Then this leads to two different visions of liberty, right?
Yeah. Yeah. He has a nice gloss on the way that the way that liberalism developed its nature of liberty. Basically that you had like a society bourgeois society coming to be, and business owners who wanted their property to be protected as like their principal political objectives, like coming up with this stuff. And it like clearly bears the roots of that, up to the present day. He says, quote, "It is not difficult to see, for example, that the atomized liberal individual reflects the atomized conditions of bourgeois society in which social ties of kinship and fealty have been dissolved, in which market competition is the norm." And he talks about the social contract, which it's funny. He says, quote, the radical individualism at the core of liberalism is perhaps most clear to see in liberal political philosophy's favorite conceptual device, the social contract. And I kind of like the social contract. I feel like is an interesting idea, like it's a clearly has some force, and like you can do some good stuff with it, as we've talked about with Hobbes and Rawls, with his, the original position and that whole business of trying to come up with a sort of moral foundation of society. But you do have to admit, I think, as he points out, that this is like a profoundly ridiculous way to think about human society, even bourgeois society. Like nobody has ever lived like this in history. Nobody's ever sat down and come up with a social like contract in terms of how we want our society to. Yeah.
It's a thought experiment to explain our nature and to suggest, based on what our human nature is, how we should therefore live. But as many people, so there's different social contexts, right? There's first Hobbes and then Locke and then Rousseau. And Hobbes is both liberal and illiberal in many ways. Locke is straight liberal. Rousseau, however, is again it's the weirdest of the three in a way. Although Hobbes is pretty weird too, but they're all kind of weird. To be honest, the thought experiments. But what they say about human nature, I think, really matters. Right? Hobbes has the atomistic individual, godless, and there is no justice outside of what we create. Locke, of course, thinks there's a natural law and a transcendent justice that we need to adhere to when we leave the state of nature. But his focus is less on not killing each other, as it is for Hobbes, and more about kind of, being industrious, although Hobbes is into that too, but having commerce and using our God-given propensity to labor and mix with the land that God gave us and so forth to create wealth for our oikos. And this is really important to liberalism, right? Like the idea from the ancients that like the oikos, which is the root of economy, which in Greek means like household, right? the oikos is the private sphere. And, if you go back to ancient Greece, it was required that you had a place in the polis, in the city, that was yours, that was, this is before like mortgages, right? Like you were free and clear, right? You did not have necessity as a problem. Like you had property, you didn't, and you in fact, and this is a big difference with 19th century and 18th century slavery, by the way, chattel slavery. You had servants, right? Or slaves, in order for you to leave the household. They would run the household, so you didn't have to. So you could be a citizen and serve the public and actually have time, the leisure to think and debate and make laws. Like this was the democracy that was being kind of, obviously in some ways, experimented with for the first time, right? And this idea was that freedom, therefore, is in this social, political, constitutive, collective act of determining how we should live together. Once necessity and instinct is no longer like past survival, okay, what's good? How should we be, right? The thing with liberalism is it flips it on its head and says, actually, let's get rid of those questions about like how we should be and what justice is and all that. And let's make the state serve the individual people in their households that they have little fiefdoms over, right? And so it's a kind of return in a way to the master-slave dynamic in a way with like the patriarchal property owner in charge of the household and the state helping them, right? And that's the beginning of the end, I think.
Yeah, and this I think is at the root of the problems in the incoherence of liberalism as it developed. It's like you had these people who were, in many instances, literal slave owners, writing about liberty and living how to construct a free society and so on. And even in the case of people who were just mere business owners without any otherwise objectionable aspects to it, you still run right into the issue that private property is really at odds with liberty and equality. Like it manifestly, if you're talking about the institution of private property, especially, you can't justify that on any kind of liberty grounds. And of course, whenever you have private property, you always have massive inequality. And that, whether you want to people try to separate it out, but of course, like massive disparity in resources creates a massive disparity in like every aspect of life, political and otherwise. And so, you're like a bunch of rich Jews trying to set up this like a state basically that will, allow them to defend their resources. But it's like the principles that they're lying out, to justify the state are pretty much straightforwardly imply that they should not have at least unfettered rights to their private property, that should have like strict and, I would say like, if you go through the logic as Rooksby does, that property would, I would say ought to be abolished as, in terms of a right, that it should be just like merely an instrumental thing, like it insofar as it serves like, liberty and equality, we could have property, like, for like home ownership or something like that. But when you're talking about like huge dragon hordes of Elon Musk with $200 billion worth of stuff, no, that, and, it just, I'm convinced by this, I think you see it, historically and just in the principles of the thing that, how I think he points out there's a wise observation that there's so many modern liberal theorists are very uncomfortable about private property. Back in the day, in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, it was life, liberty, and property. And now it's like, ooh, that one's they're a little squicky about that one. They don't want to talk about it.
And it's interesting. He gets into the philosopher Etienne Balibar and his understanding of equilibrity as a way of merging equality and liberty into one word so that people don't get confused about how those things work together. Because properly understood, say the socialists, right, these things have to go together. And we've said on the podcast before something like, no one is free until everyone is free. Like that, the point of equality, right, is that everyone's equally free, but not equally free to participate in the market, right? Because that's not actually freedom, as we all can see here, right? And so that explanation that like separating the oikos or the private sphere as the sphere of freedom is the perversity, because then economic participation, right, is what freedom is. And that's freedom in a market that can then dominate you by the asymmetry of power and inequalities of wealth. And the political process is not supposed to get involved there, right? So he says, quote, even though economic power is political power, this may be safely ignored by the bourgeoisie. State power, however, is not and cannot be unambiguously in the hands of the capitalist class. And so it is this concentrated site of power that liberalism is most concerned to guard against. The interests and concerns of property then underpin and define the terms of the liberal conception of liberty. Right. So in other words, like liberals, whether they want to say so or not, they don't call out capitalist or economic oppression, power, dominance, exploitation, asymmetries, because they're more concerned with the state, the negative liberty of the state not interfering with your marriage, not interfering. Like those are all good things, right? But for the socialists, positive freedom is actually requires economic democracy and economic rights and economic power and economic equality, right? And so you have liberalism, which is individual and focused on negative liberty, like as against state intervention, leave me alone, right? No wonder so many people are lonely these days, and like how hard it is to do anything because everyone thinks through like, what can I do as an individual? I'm going to go vote. And that's the end of the path for me, because what else can I do? Versus socialists who think about collective action, collective good, public good, common good, and positive freedom, right? And a kind of bringing together of the economic and the political, because they actually go together, right?
Yeah.
Makes sense to me.
And I would say, you're recognizing like liberals, they want to pretend that like you have all these barriers in the Bill of Rights, what the government can't do to you, supposedly. But, the fact is like the government is always acting on behalf of people who own property. Like that's what private property is. It's the state.
It's not neutral at all. Yeah.
Yeah. The property is a relationship between people. You own something when the government says you do.
That's right.
So you can go to the police or to the courts, to get people to enforce with violence, if necessary, your claim to that property. And so
I love you pointing out that you're pointing out that liberal and libertarian invocations of negative liberty are a lie. The state is never not involved. Yeah. No, that's a great point.
The state creates the economy. And so, if you're taking justice and equality seriously, you have to say, okay, well, this state power should be deployed, on behalf of like the common good and not just on behalf of rich people.
Now, I know everyone that's listening has read your book probably twice, but you do so well in it to explain this. Can you explain that statement that the state creates the economy? Because for those that need to read your book a third time, maybe they need to hear you explain it now.
Well, this is not an original idea at all. But, when you look at the structure of private property and like market transactions and all of that stuff, I mentioned before how property is political. Property is created, defined by the state. And I think that just penetrates all the way down to the core of every economic everything. What is money? That's created by the government. What is the market? Yeah, the market is created through government structures in terms of like buying and selling versus like stealing, through corporate law, securities law, labor law, all the various regulations about, like pure food and water, that like all this stuff is necessary to sort of breathe a capitalist economy into life in the first place. Classical liberals and libertarians want to deny that. They want to say it's all John Galt, it's all Elon Musk, the entrepreneur. But the entrepreneur is standing and depends on the government at every turn. And
they're very, besides the tax breaks, the very entity that we call a corporation is a legal fiction created by the state. Right. Yeah. Not to mention the laws around it. Right. And so maybe this is a good transition to we can return to the Rooksby piece, but to the Liam Kofi Bright piece, because this reality of the state not being able to be neutral, and it's descriptively never neutral, flies in the face of one of the tenets of liberalism, which is like proceduralism, neutrality about the good or the good life, right? Or the common good. And this idea that with capitalism, right, the market will determine things and the government will just protect, equality is just a matter of having formal political rights, even though like we're not allowing substantively anything to do with the economy to be actually done, which you kind of gave lied to. It actually means favoring the capitalist class, this faux neutrality. So this, Professor Bright points out, leads to, all these problems we're seeing with climate change and inequality. It literally doesn't work the way that liberalism pretends it does. And it doesn't actually have a kind of neutral playing field for different visions of the good to be kind of like democratically decided because, and this is not so much in anything we read, but we can talk about it. Liberalism isn't actually in favor of democracy, to be honest, right? Because first of all, it doesn't want democracy in the workplace. It doesn't want democracy in the household. It doesn't want like equality of power anywhere else other than formally politically. And it's also about elections and electoral systems, which, as other theorists have pointed out, the idea of meritocracy or elections is aristocratic. Actually, democracy in ancient Athens, for a reason, was by lottery. It was like, put your hat in there and then you get picked out of the hat. Okay, go serve for a couple of years and then come back out. And it wasn't what an election is, which is who's best. That's literally, aristocracy means rule by the best. It's literally, by design, an election is aristocratic, right? And so, the suffrage problem of who's allowed to vote and these justifications for inequality, which are so much like, well, you didn't deserve, the person who's rich deserves it because he's a genius. Elon Musk is a genius, right? People that are poor, they must be lazy, right? These meritocratic arguments are anti-democratic because they're about basically aristocratic thinking, right? Or it's a mask for oligarchic plutocratic thinking. Whoever has the money is the best, basically. And so like Bright says we need to actually get rid of this idea of neutrality and proceduralism, put the conflicts out in the open because there's actual conflicts about what's good and actually have that as the basis for society, right?
Yeah, I was, he brings up a historical justification for liberalism that we didn't, that Rooksby doesn't mention, which has to do with the wars of religion. In like the 1600s, and you had Catholics and Protestants slugging it out in various horrible wars.
It was like having a 9/11 event like every week for years.
30 years wars killed like a third of the population of like parts of Germany.
That's right.
Really bad.
I mean, when you look at Hobbes's front piece, it's an epidemic, right? A plague town. There's actual like plague doctors walking around. It's an empty town because not only did they have these holy wars that decimated, right, the population based on people saying they know what God wants, but you had also these out of control plagues that were happening regularly. So, Understandably, the idea that Hobbes kind of made prominent that, hey, maybe we should focus less on like who knows God's thoughts and like just not kill each other and have some stability, right?
Yeah, right. And so the idea that you can sort of divide up private versus public questions of reason and politics. And you could say like religion is a private matter. It's not for the government to tell you what to do one way or the other, which is sort of like definitely. I mean, I guess people argue about this, but like it was definitely related to religious squabbling over like what's the state religion going to be in this place versus this place. Of course, there's a lot of other parts to it, but I think that, Bright is onto something in terms of saying that that's like basically fictitious, that like that the state is always taking sides to some degree. And, you like, certainly you could say like this was a failure in that liberalism did not manage to prevent wars. In fact, like it enabled technological progress. It made wars much worse.
That's right. Yeah.
The
liberalism famously known for war and colonialism and slavery. So
yeah, it's like you get your first couple of like full-fledged liberal states going in France and Britain, and immediately 20 years of war across the whole of Europe. And it's just like you're maybe keeping a lid on conflict to some degree, but it's, there's really no way to prevent, there's no procedural way to stop conflict from breaking out. And if people are bound and determined to fight enough, they're going to fight. And I think you see that today in the United States, the all-out assault on trans people and LGBT people writ large, just straightforwardly anti-liberal assault on people's like private, their way they behave, supposedly in the private sphere. And it's like people, if people don't care about that, you have a fascist movement.
Hang on a second. Notice, though, how even conservatism is rooted in that liberal distinction between private and public, because what do they say the bad thing is? It's harming the kids who are under me and the oikos, and that, right? So I'm justifying my fascist hate by appealing to my role as a parent, right? And that's a very liberal move, actually.
Yeah, right. They've all internalized. I mean, even though that's bullshit, it's just lies. Right. But they've internalized the value set of liberalism so profoundly that they can't think any other way.
Well, and that's cool. That's Professor Bright's point, though, isn't it? He's saying all arguments, whether you know it or not, are taking place today within the framework of liberalism, and he says we need to unmask the actual thing, right? Which is like, it's not about you wanting to be a better parent. It's about you hate people that are different, and right. And like, if you get rid of the justificatory liberal framing of everything that's hegemonic, you can actually say, no, it's okay. We need to come out with our real differences here. And then when you look at the Tradcaths, when you look at they're proudly, I'm illiberal. And that's where we're like, oh, look, they're proudly proclaiming their fascism. And that's because they have shed the mask of neutrality of liberalism, right? And so it's easy to see the hatred and the evil that way. But that's really good for which vision of the future do we want here? Look, let's not get bamboozled by these appeals to parenthood, right?
Yeah. I guess, I don't know. I mean, I guess as a descriptive matter, I'd say, this is how it is and basically how it has to be. But I do wonder if it's not possible to actually have this in practice, that you can sort of grope towards it a little bit, have a public sphere that is at least a little bit neutral on stuff like, religion and private morality and whatnot, to where people the conservatives do feel somewhat restrained in their ability to go after minorities and stuff because of a strong norm of non-interference in quote unquote private matters. And
Yeah,
I guess I'm mixed. I'm of two minds on that.
No, but
question.
Okay. So this is where it gets tricky, right? Because like, it's not actually neutral to say that we tolerate different religions. Actually, right? Because as conservatives have probably pointed out, it's a performative contradiction. I am not tolerant of people who are intolerant, actually.
Yeah.
Right? And so like there is a hierarchy. The hierarchy is tolerance is above intolerance, first of all. And that's what liberalism has a hierarchy. It has values. It's bullshit to say it doesn't. But here's where we get into trouble is liberals get confused when socialists say, let's punch Nazis and not platform Richard Spencer, right? Liberals or libertarians like Connor Friedersdorf are like, oh, you're the problem. Violence. No. The fascists, they're violent. No. Those people are not debatable. You don't debate them, right? And that's where liberals can get confused because, as Rooksby points out, or maybe Bright does too, maybe both, liberals forget the violent revolutionary origins of their ideology, right?
Yeah.
That you actually have to force the feudalistic, reactionaries. You have to defeat them in order to instantiate your order, right? That's peaceful and about tolerance and dialogue.
Yeah. Brooksby has a good line on this. He says, quote, once the ancien regime was defeated and the liberal order safely embedded, the genesis of this order and rebellion became something of an embarrassment and even a liability because from the start, the new order was looking anxiously over its shoulder at a potential challenger.
That's right. Exactly. That's important.
Yeah.
No,
yeah. And I
true.
think, I feel like you could say as a liberal, you could sort of admit to your values and say, I am militantly in favor of like kicking Nazis off the platforms or whatever. I feel like a lot of sort of normie libs have become radicalized in exactly this fashion. You realize it's like you have these values like free speech and so on, and that you have people who are just like all but plotting in plain sight. Like, we're going to take your freedoms away and we're going to use your freedoms to do it. And there's nothing you can do about it. We're like, cackling over this like bubbling pot of poison or something. And, and in that case, it's like, well, okay, I guess we're done talking. But you're definitely right that there's a, people privilege the form of these. It's like, free speech. We talked about this in our episode with the professors of, who's he, what's it, but about free speech on campus. It's like, what's the point of free speech? It's not just about anyone to say whatever they want all the time. It's like, this is part of a whole political system, to allow people to like live
and specifically, specifically, it's about democracy and education, which is supposed to form us into people who have knowledge and access to what's true, what's false, what's good, what's bad. In other words, what Aristotle defined as the point of a polis, or the political point, which is justice. What's the good life? What's the way to live? Let's make informed decisions, not just instinctual ones or not just self-interested ones. Let's try to use our imagination to understand what's in our common good and interest. Like, that's the political reason why we should, in other words, there's a difference between leave me alone and I want to do whatever I want, which Hobbes defined the same as liberty. He says license and liberty. Everyone just says good and bad are things that people say that are objective, but that's just what you like. That's just like your opinion, man, right? Like things that you like, you call them good. Things that are bad, you call them evil. And that's just an individual like aesthetic choice almost, right? But if you get into a different vision, which is that no, your good and my good are kind of intertwined. And it's not just a matter of license or feeling. Like, there are things that if I pursue them because I want them, that will actually be bad and against my interest, even if I desire them. You know what I mean? And that might relate into how it affects you. And like, look at the pandemic for that, lesson. There's a number of lessons like this, right? Capitalism's a perfect lesson in that. Let's just all consume however we want. What could go wrong? You know what I mean? And what could go wrong is it actually redounds to harm us as individuals as well as parts of communities, right?
Yeah.
So what was the origin of that bit there about freedom of speech? Because we're talking about, it's not just a formal thing, like procedural or formal equality, formal liberty. You have to give substance. You have to give a real vision to how we want to be. And Rooksby talks about Marx and species being and this idea of like reciprocity and mutual flourishing, where like we self-realize in a way that has to be part of a society. Like, everyone should watch Astor Taylor's documentary, What is Democracy? If you haven't, if you've seen it, but just once, see it again. She goes to Greece and she talks to some Greek professors about how Plato says that a good person is brought up in a good city, right? And you are grateful because the city brought you up, it formed you, it shaped you. And there's that relationship, that symbiotic relationship between your good and the common good. And like, that's something that we've lost with this atomistic vision of reality, right? And we need to reclaim it.
Yeah, to return to Rooksby a little bit, he has, the last part of his paper is about a different ontological foundation. And basically he says, the social contract, it's a neat idea maybe, but, think about how people actually live. How do they grow up? How do they come by their notions? It's like, well, you're raised by your parents who teach you how to speak a language that has evolved over centuries and millennia, in fact.
And they were shaped in a community, right? Yeah.
Yeah. That like you just trace out the vast web of interdependence, that I talk about this in my book too, but it's like how the idea that anybody could individually come up to just spring fully formed from the head of Zeus and like have views and opinions and like
the view from nowhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
But the liberals sometimes get this. Like, remember Obama's "You didn't build that" speech, which he got raked over the coals for? They sometimes understand this interdependence.
You put it like that, and it's totally undeniable. Like it's just like blatantly obvious, and nobody could possibly argue against it. I think Shakespeare had a play about this. But the liberalism, I guess, ontologically is still based on this notion of just like totally independent, atomized individuals coming together for self-interested reasons to sign the social contract. And it's like, well, how could we do this in a better way? Like what's a more realistic foundation? And basically Rooksby, he says he tries to root the equilibrity, this notion from the other philosopher, that equality and liberty are like dialectically intertwined and dependent on each other in like a basically social ontology framework, saying that we're basically, his argument is that we're naturally cooperative social beings who depend on each other to like even have a notion of selfhood. Like that is created through an interrelation with others.
That's right. Our very subjectivity is socially created. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You can't.
Who I think I am is I think of myself through the eyes of how you look at me and how I think others think of me. And this is Rousseau's point too,
Yeah. He says, quote, "It is not just that we live, behave, and especially labor socially and cooperatively. It is also that our very subjectivity, our conception of selfhood, is constituted socially. We become consciously aware of ourselves as a discrete entity distinct from the natural world and from other humans only through language. And language is inherently intersubjective. It is a social practice." You're speaking to somebody else. You're writing down something for somebody else to read. You're reading something that somebody else wrote so that you could read it. As you point this out at the beginning of your book, right?
If the economy was individual based, as everyone says it is, and the kind of austerity scolds and the people that tell you how to make a huge amount of money by saving money, if they were right, then if everyone individually saves, that would be great, right? But then that happened. People were forced to save in the pandemic, and everything fell apart because you know what? Your savings mean that you're not spending money that I need for my income, right? And vice versa. Like when you spend, there's the reciprocity there. The consumption and the spending go together, and so it's like ontologically untrue that we're individuals and that the economy is based in that kind of reality, right?
Yeah, and so I'm definitely like in favor of this as a sort of redescription of, trying to sell this to people, but I guess I'm a little bit unsure of this in terms of, he's trying to root it almost in like a moral fashion, saying that like,
which one are you talking about? Bright or Rooksby at this point?
Rooksby, he's saying,
okay.
The realization of, quote, the realization of these principles is a necessary condition and constituent part of the realization of our nature. We could say that equilibrium is simply in our bones. And that, I guess I'm less sure about.
Sure.
I mean, I think it is definitionally the case that we always work together. And like we as we've been saying, we are social beings. We always have been, we always will be, as long as there are human beings. That's just how it is. But it does seem to be that you can create a sort of like society in which everyone is sort of convinced that they are individuals and behave.
Oh, that's the point. Yes. Okay. So let me, I don't know if this is Rooksby's point, but here's a point that like what you're saying fits with Rousseau. Rousseau basically, Rousseau kind of does think that we start out individuals in the state of nature, whereas Aristotle thinks that by our nature we're political animals. We're literally designed to be in community because he has this clever argument about nothing in nature is designed without purpose. And so why do we have language? It's so that we can talk to each other, so we can learn how to live, to figure out how to have not just mere life, but a good life. That's what takes us and differentiates us from animals who live off of instinct and don't have the self. And this fits with like what Martin Hoagland says in This Life in a way, right? That spiritual freedom he describes. But Rousseau, he thinks we start out as individuals, but that our nature is that we can become many things. We're actually not fixed. We have this propensity to be shaped by our environment tremendously. And that the important thing, though, is he rejects that we are naturally fixed in any way. And in fact, naturally, even though we are individual, naturally we are not antagonistic and competitive and egoistic. That society, which we created through our free will, we became the bourgeois. We became through our reason, actually, he says, right? He's like, if you look at a horse, it won't walk past a dead horse with no empathy or feeling, right? It took civilization and reason to be able to do that, for us to like not have that natural pity or sympathy for another creature that's like us or for a creature that's similar to us, right? Our reason that we use, which we have naturally, we created a distance from our natural sympathy and so forth. And naturally, we're actually much more cooperative and empathetic and compassionate and all these things. But we have this ability to adapt, and we're shaped so much by our environment. So your point is actually that we could go against that empathetic, pitying, cooperative nature, or we could go against what Aristotle would say is our nature, which is collectivist and communal, and, like you say, convince ourselves artificially that we're not. Which is why you always see these naturalizing arguments. Nope, capitalism is natural. Nope, competition is natural. Nope. And my students, when I ask them if they had a universal basic income, they say, "Oh, it's a terrible idea because everyone will just." I mean, they don't say spend it on, hookers and coke, but like that's, they'll just watch Netflix all day. And then when I ask them, wait, will you just watch Netflix all day? They say, oh, no, not me. No, everyone else, those other idiots, right? Everyone else is lazy and mean and envious and so forth. Right. But Rousseau's point, and I think the point of a lot of theorists, is that that's not naturally true. We have created conditions to make that true and to make us think that about each other. We have shaped ourselves to be worse in many ways because of this ontology, right? Because it's like when somebody calls you a criminal, you start to believe it. Well, if you start to hear over and over again, right, everyone's out to get you, you're on your own, pull yourself up from your bootstraps, you start to live into that subjectivity that's shaped socially, though, right?
Yeah.
So we don't have to do that.
Yeah, I guess I'm just kind of struggling with the idea that this like makes for. I mean, one I could say certainly, and I do believe, you like human beings are a lot seem to thrive better whenever the society is more equal. Like you look at the surveys of what's the happiest countries. It's typically the Nordics somewhere. Which is quite remarkable because lack of sunlight has a profound influence on your expressed happiness. It's just super low stress, high trust society where people cooperate and there's a lot of socializing. And you look at a place like the United States, I don't think you can divorce inequality from the number of suicides and gun deaths and drug overdoses. People drinking themselves to death and so on. And yeah, so like from, I guess, like a practical standpoint, this is just plainly a better way to live. But ontologically speaking, it seems like, we have a sort of tendency, you could say, but like, is there like a natural way that you can, I don't know, sort of like iron it out aside from just being a tendency? I don't know. I guess I'm not expressing myself well exactly.
No, I think I understand what you're saying. Well, there's two things, and I'm wondering which point you're making. Is it that we don't need to iron out metaphysics or the ontological reality of our nature? Which, again, for Rousseau and for Marx, our nature is not fixed anyway. So, like, if what you mean by nature is an unchanging thing, well, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, in fact, a nature that is highly, if anything, we are highly sensitive to our environment and to the norms that we create. But if our nature is to be so adaptive, what Rousseau calls perfectibility, we and it doesn't have to be in a good way, but we just change according to what we think we're supposed to do so much, right? If that's the case, then we have a lot of power collectively, because a lot of students saw that as a negative thing, like, oh, we don't have a certain nature, we just change all the time. But that means we're responsible for the mess we've made also, because it doesn't have to be that way. It's not natural. It's artificial. We've created this pain for ourselves, and we can create flourishing for ourselves. I think there's freedom and hope in that, right? Yeah,
I agree. I guess it just seems to me that there's maybe a contradiction if you're saying that like this we need to be doing this because it's natural with reference to like a species whose nature is evidently like very plastic, that like you need something aside from just like that it being the natural state to be like sort of the argument for it. But as we've been saying, like it clearly, evidence for that does abound. And I don't think it's necessary to cast it this way. And I'm not sure that's exactly what Rooksby is really saying here, rather than just kind of a rhetorical flourish, as it were.
Well, let me ask you, because look, I get it. It's very modern and postmodern to attack human nature as such, right? The idea that like we should do something because that's how we're designed. People make fun of that in a lot of ways, and that, I get it. It depends how you take that, right? Because someone could say, well, then you shouldn't wear glasses because that's not natural. But that's not actually the point. Like if you look at what Aristotle means by telos, which is like both purpose and nature of something. The telos of an acorn is to become an oak tree. And that is both descriptively true what it is, and therefore it flourishes when it becomes what it's supposed to become. Now, of course, like becoming an oak tree and how human beings should flourish, very different things, of course. And that's where you get into pluralism and all kinds of ways to become an oak tree collectively, I guess, right? But like if I don't have good sight, my eyes were designed to see, and this could be seen as ableist, and I get that, but I want to say like, if there's an option to see or not see, better to see. That's what they're for. You know what I mean? And like there are people that would say that's an ableist thing, and I get that. But I think there are parallels there, right? We have capacities, talents, and Marx would say this too. there's a kind of beauty in realizing our capacities together. And this goes together with our capacity for joy and for pleasure and for like community and love and all kinds of things, right? Above survival, there's all kinds of things that freedom is for. And this is what Haugland's thing is about. And deciding for ourselves, individually and collectively, what our commitments should be and what we should value. It's not that there's a fixed essence that says how that should go. And as, the existentialists do, they reverse it. Existence precedes essence. You define for yourself what is most important. But that's both a responsibility and a freedom. But like, that's real. That's important. It's not just like, do whatever you want and like, oh, I can say the only thing that's bad is when I see actual violence happening. You know what I mean? Like that leads to people saying that I'm being a good parent when they're actually being violent against trans people, right? Like we have to codify, if not what each individual life should be like, what it means to flourish. And I think you might be saying that doesn't have to be in our nature or something, but like, so maybe we don't have to ground it metaphysically or ontologically. I don't know. But like, is it so difficult to say we're all meant to flourish together? And that looks all kinds of ways. And there's all kinds of ways that doesn't look. Wittgenstein would say that like, just because you can't pin something down doesn't mean there's no meaning there. He says like, in fact, you can't define a game. Everyone knows what a game is, but there's not, if you say like a game has to be defined and there has to be one feature that all games have in common, can't do it. And yet you recognize that these are all games. So does it mean because you can't define it, you can't pin it down that it doesn't have meaning, doesn't exist? No. We know what games are. We play the games. Same thing. Life has meaning, right? Freedom has meaning. Love has meaning. Just because you can't pin it down doesn't mean these things aren't real. That's all I want to say. I want to say these things are real and they're part of who we are. And if that's not human nature, then we're misdefining it maybe. Yeah.
No, I certainly accept a prudential, a case for this. It was like an empirical, you could say, that you could buy the sort of metaphysical part or not, but like just look around you, right. I think that one of the reasons why billionaires are so insane is because having that much wealth, it cuts you off from society. And I think it's like literally brain damaging to do that to yourself. You have no friends, you have no relationship aside from like a handful of, what are often just like toadies and courtiers. And that's no way to live.
Here's the thing.
It's sick.
Here's the thing, Ryan. If Elon Musk and Donald Trump tell you that they're happy, I say, metaphysically, ontologically, I am right when I say that they're not happy. And that, right? No, I know better than they do if they say that about the reality of their happiness. It's not just a subjective thing, right? And maybe that's historically contingent. Maybe that's whatever, empirically verified. But like, even to say that it's better to have good brain health, you can't ground that in empirics itself. You have to have theory. Yeah. That's why I'm a theorist.
Yeah. I mean,
good stuff,
you look at them and they're clearly unhappy, but even if they could behave in a way that seemed like they genuinely were, I would agree with that. Yeah. This is no way to live.
This is what my students get all excited about in the Republic, right? There's this famous ring of Gyges hypothesis, where this guy has it kind of predates Lord of the Rings, obviously. Like this guy puts on a ring, he's invisible, and so he's able to like kill the king and sleep with the king's wife and become king and all that. And this is a challenge to Socrates by Glaucon, who says, "Hey, you want me to think that the happy life, the good life, is the just life. But I think the reality appearance distinction is actually more salient. What if I appear to be good and actually I'm as evil as I want? Isn't that more profitable for me than being good but not being seen as being good?" And this brings up all kinds of interesting things because Socrates was killed, Jesus was crucified. And so like this whole thing that Machiavelli then plays with is, don't appearances matter more than reality? And so the rest of the book is kind of trying to answer that. No, it's actually better to be good and to match truth to appearance, right, than play with appearances, which is what politicians do all the time now, right? And so like, because that's about power. And so I asked them, okay, let's talk about happiness. let's say you are married and your whole long life, you think you have a loyal spouse and you die happy, you think. Actually, your spouse was cheating on you for 30 years. Were you actually happy? Right? And the students get confused because they thought they were happy, but it was based on a lie. That what they didn't have the actual real relationship they thought they had. So they were deluded in the same way that Trump and Musk might be deluded. You know what I mean? Like, this is the idea that wisdom, good, the true, and the beautiful have to match with power and with what we do, or else you have a real problem, right? You have injustice and unhappiness.
Well, that's I think a good place to wind up. We've solved all the problems of philosophy, politics, and human nature. You heard it here first. We've ironed it out.
No, thanks to Ed Rooksby and Liam Kofi Bright. We didn't get to Owen's response, but he was actually pointing out that Liam's affinity for nominalism, which, relates to the individual ontology, is a problem. And Rooksby, I think, would agree. But like, we ironed it out based on 3 readings. So I guess we have to close the shop now.
Yep. We'll link those in the description. Good stuff. Not too technical. Even a dummy like myself can get through it. Oh, and if you like this episode, let us know. If you want us to read other stuff and, have intense intellectual discussions about it. But we thank you for listening, and we'll see you in the next episode.
Bye-bye.